Sometimes a man runs to the mountains not to escape the world, but to escape what he's capable of becoming in it. Jonas Hale had spent 5 years in those Montana peaks, learning to live with his ghosts, until the day a dying man brought him a choice he couldn't walk away from. Cal Everett collapsed at his door, blood soaking through his shirt, whispering one desperate plea. "Please, hide my sister." Behind him stood Maria, trembling but defiant, chased off her family's land by hired guns working for a cattle baron. Those same men were still coming. Jonas looked from the dying brother to the frightened sister. He helped Cal inside, then stepped back out into the dawn. The sound of his rifle lever echoed through the valley. "Ain't hiding nobody," he said quietly. "Not from men like them." What happens when the man they should have left alone decides to make his stand? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes a man runs to the mountains, not to escape the world, but to escape what he's capable of becoming in it. Jonas Hale had spent 5 years in those Montana peaks, learning to live with his ghosts, until the day a dying man brought him a choice he couldn't walk away from. Cal Everett collapsed at his door, blood soaking through his shirt, whispering one desperate plea. "Please, hide my sister." Behind him stood Maria, trembling but defiant, chased off her family's land by hired guns working for a cattle baron. Those same men were still coming. Jonas looked from the dying brother to the frightened sister. He helped Cal inside, then stepped back out into the dawn. The sound of his rifle lever echoed through the valley. "Ain't hiding nobody," he said quietly. "Not from men like them." What happens when the man they should have left alone decides to make his stand? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at the end of a long climb, perched on a rocky shelf where the pine forest thinned and gave way to granite and sky. It was a modest structure, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of old bone. The roof was cedar shake, patched in places where winter had been unkind. A stone chimney rose from the north side, smoke curling from it most mornings when the air turned cold. Jonas Hale had built it himself, one log at a time, during his first year in these mountains. Every corner was square, every joint tight. It was the work of a man who understood that survival depended on details. The land around the cabin was hard country. Rock and pine dominated the higher elevations, with scrub brush clinging to whatever soil could gather in the crevices. Below, where the mountains sloped toward the valley, there were meadows of wild grass and stands of aspen that turned gold in the fall. A creek ran cold and clear about 50 yards from the cabin, fed by snowmelt that never quite stopped flowing. Jonas had built a small corral near the creek. For his 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding and a grey mare that had seen better days but still had heart. Jonas was a man carved by time and circumstance into something lean and hard. He stood just over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of work and a frame that carried no excess. His hair was dark, threaded with grey at the temples, and he wore it longer than he had in his younger years, tied back when he worked. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes and mouth, not from smiling, but from squinting into distances and enduring weather. His eyes were grey, the color of winter clouds, and they held a kind of stillness that came from seeing too much. He was 43 years old. Though he looked both older and ageless at once, he had come to these mountains 5 years ago with little more than a horse, a rifle, and a need to be far from people. Before that, there had been the war. The Civil War had taken 4 years of his life and left him with a chest full of medals he never wore and memories he couldn't shake. He'd served with distinction, too much distinction, really. They called him a hero, pinned a Congressional Medal of Honor on his chest at a ceremony in Washington. He'd stood there in his dress uniform, shaking hands with generals and politicians, and felt nothing but emptiness. The medal was in his cabin now, tucked inside a tobacco tin on a high shelf. He never looked at it. It represented a version of himself he'd tried to bury up here in the high country, A man who'd been good at killing, who'd led men into battle and brought too few of them home. After the war, he'd tried to return to normal life. There had been a wife once, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes and a patient heart. They'd married young before the war. She'd waited for him, and when he came back, she'd tried to love the man he'd become. But he was hollow inside, haunted by the faces of the dead, both enemy and friend. She'd endured it for 2 years before the fever took her. Maybe it was a mercy. He'd failed her long before she died. After Sarah passed, Jonas had drifted west. He couldn't bear to stay in Virginia, where everything reminded him of what he'd lost. He worked as a ranch hand in Wyoming, then as a hunting guide in Colorado. But everywhere he went, people eventually learned who he was. The war hero, Jonas the Ghost. That's what his men had called him during the conflict, because he could move through enemy territory without being seen or heard. The name had followed him, and with it came expectations he couldn't meet. So he'd kept moving, going higher and farther, until he found this spot in the Montana wilderness where no one knew his name and no one asked questions. His days had fallen into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. He rose before dawn, started the fire, made coffee strong enough to strip paint. He tended the horses, checked his traps, hunted when he needed meat. In the summer, he gathered firewood for winter. In the fall, he smoked venison and caught fish from the high lakes. Winter was the hardest, weeks of snow and isolation that could break a man's mind if he wasn't careful. But Jonas had learned to endure it. He read by firelight, maintained his equipment, and kept himself busy enough to avoid the worst of the darkness that sometimes crept into his thoughts. He spoke to no one for months at a time. Twice a year he rode down to the settlement of Ironwood, a day's journey to the south, to trade furs for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. He never stayed long. The town made him uneasy. All those people pressed together, all that noise and expectation. He'd buy what he needed, maybe share a drink at the saloon to be polite, then ride back into the mountains, where the silence was clean and honest. This morning had started like any other. Jonas had risen in the dark, lit the fire, and set the coffee to boil. He'd stepped outside into the cool September dawn, breathing in air that smelled of pine and coming autumn. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the clouds with shades of rose and gold. He'd walked to the creek to fill his bucket when he heard it, the sound of a horse laboring up the trail. It was unusual enough to make him stop and listen. No one came up here. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like a suggestion in the rocks that only someone determined could follow. Jonas set down the bucket and returned to the cabin. He retrieved his rifle, a lever-action Winchester that he kept clean and ready, and positioned himself where he could see the approach without being easily seen himself. Old habits from the war. Even after 5 years of peace, his body remembered how to prepare for trouble. The rider came into view as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. It was a young man, maybe 25, slumped over the neck of a tired horse. Even from a distance, Jonas could see the dark stain on the man's shirt. Blood. Behind him, on foot, came a young woman. She was struggling with the terrain, her dress torn and dirty, but she kept pace with the horse. One hand on its flank for support, Jonas watched them approach, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. He assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a man trained for combat. The young man was badly wounded, maybe dying. The woman was exhausted and frightened, but she moved with determination. No weapons visible, no sign of pursuit yet, but the way the woman kept glancing back over her shoulder suggested someone was coming. The horse stumbled the last few yards and stopped near the cabin. The young man tried to dismount but lacked the strength. He slid from the saddle and collapsed onto the hard-packed dirt of Jonas's yard. The woman cried out and dropped to her knees beside him. Jonas stepped out from his position, rifle lowered but not set aside. The woman's head snapped up at the sound of his boots on the ground. Her eyes were dark brown, wide with fear and desperation. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her dark hair falling loose from what had once been a careful braid. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. Please help him. He's my brother. Jonas approached slowly, his eyes scanning the trail behind them. Still no sign of pursuit, but that didn't mean much. He knelt beside the young man and pulled back his shirt to examine the wound. A bullet had entered just below the ribs on the left side. There was a lot of blood, but the young man was still breathing, though it was shallow and labored. The young man's eyes flickered open. They were the same dark brown as his sister's. He looked up at Jonas with a gaze that held both pain and urgency. "Please," he whispered, barely audible. "Hide my sister!" Jonas met his eyes and saw something there he recognized, the look of a man who knew he was dying but had one last vital thing to accomplish. Jonas had seen that look on battlefields, in the eyes of soldiers who used their final breaths to pass messages or pleas. "Who's after you?" Jonas asked, his voice low and steady. "Tate's men," the young man managed. "Garrison Tate. They're coming." Sometimes a man runs to the mountains not to escape the world, but to escape what he's capable of becoming in it. Jonas Hale had spent 5 years in those Montana peaks, learning to live with his ghosts, until the day a dying man brought him a choice he couldn't walk away from. Cal Everett collapsed at his door, blood soaking through his shirt, whispering one desperate plea. "Please, hide my sister." Behind him stood Maria, trembling but defiant, chased off her family's land by hired guns working for a cattle baron. Those same men were still coming. Jonas looked from the dying brother to the frightened sister. He helped Cal inside, then stepped back out into the dawn. The sound of his rifle lever echoed through the valley. "Ain't hiding nobody," he said quietly. "Not from men like them." What happens when the man they should have left alone decides to make his stand? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at the end of a long climb, perched on a rocky shelf where the pine forest thinned and gave way to granite and sky. It was a modest structure, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of old bone. The roof was cedar shake, patched in places where winter had been unkind. A stone chimney rose from the north side, smoke curling from it most mornings when the air turned cold. Jonas Hale had built it himself, one log at a time, during his first year in these mountains. Every corner was square, every joint tight. It was the work of a man who understood that survival depended on details. The land around the cabin was hard country. Rock and pine dominated the higher elevations, with scrub brush clinging to whatever soil could gather in the crevices. Below, where the mountains sloped toward the valley, there were meadows of wild grass and stands of aspen that turned gold in the fall. A creek ran cold and clear about 50 yards from the cabin, fed by snowmelt that never quite stopped flowing. Jonas had built a small corral near the creek. For his 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding and a grey mare that had seen better days but still had heart. Jonas was a man carved by time and circumstance into something lean and hard. He stood just over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of work and a frame that carried no excess. His hair was dark, threaded with grey at the temples, and he wore it longer than he had in his younger years, tied back when he worked. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes and mouth, not from smiling, but from squinting into distances and enduring weather. His eyes were grey, the color of winter clouds, and they held a kind of stillness that came from seeing too much. He was 43 years old, though he looked both older and ageless at once. He had come to these mountains 5 years ago with little more than a horse, a rifle, and a need to be far from people. Before that, there had been the war. The Civil War had taken 4 years of his life and left him with memories he couldn't shake. He'd served with distinction, too much distinction, really. They called him a hero, pinned a Congressional Medal of Honor on his chest at a ceremony in Washington. He'd stood there in his dress uniform, shaking hands with generals and politicians, and felt nothing but emptiness. The medal was in his cabin now, tucked inside a tobacco tin on a high shelf. He never looked at it. It represented a version of himself he'd tried to bury up here in the high country, a man who'd been good at killing, who'd led men into battle and brought too few of them home. After the war, he'd tried to return to normal life. There had been a wife once, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes and a patient heart. They'd married young, before the war. She'd waited for him, and when he came back, she'd tried to love the man he'd become. But he was hollow inside, haunted by the faces of the dead, both enemy and friend. She'd endured it for 2 years before the fever took her. Maybe it was a mercy. He'd failed her long before she died. After Sarah passed, Jonas had drifted west. He couldn't bear to stay in Virginia, where everything reminded him of what he'd lost. He worked as a ranch hand in Wyoming, then as a hunting guide in Colorado. But everywhere he went, people eventually learned who he was. The war hero, Jonas the Ghost. That's what his men had called him during the conflict, because he could move through enemy territory without being seen or heard. The name had followed him, and with it came expectations he couldn't meet. So he'd kept moving, going higher and farther, until he found this spot in the Montana wilderness where no one knew his name and no one asked questions. His days had fallen into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. He rose before dawn, started the fire, made coffee strong enough to strip paint. He tended the horses, checked his traps, hunted when he needed meat. In the summer, he gathered firewood for winter. In the fall, he smoked venison and caught fish from the high lakes. Winter was the hardest, weeks of snow and isolation that could break a man's mind if he wasn't careful. But Jonas had learned to endure it. He read by firelight, maintained his equipment, and kept himself busy enough to avoid the worst of the darkness that sometimes crept into his thoughts. He spoke to no one for months at a time. Twice a year, he rode down to the settlement of Ironwood, a day's journey to the south, to trade furs for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. He never stayed long. The town made him uneasy, all those people pressed together, all that noise and expectation. He'd buy what he needed, maybe share a drink at the saloon to be polite, then ride back into the mountains where the silence was clean and honest. This morning had started like any other. Jonas had risen in the dark, lit the fire and set the coffee to boil. He'd stepped outside into the cool September dawn, breathing in air that smelled of pine and coming autumn. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the clouds with shades of rose and gold. He'd walked to the creek to fill his bucket when he heard it, the sound of a horse laboring up the trail. It was unusual enough to make him stop and listen. No one came up here. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like a suggestion in the rocks that only someone determined could follow. Jonas set down the bucket and returned to the cabin. He retrieved his rifle, a lever-action Winchester that he kept clean and ready, and positioned himself where he could see the approach without being easily seen himself. Old habits from the war. Even after 5 years of peace, his body remembered how to prepare for trouble. The rider came into view as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. It was a young man, maybe 25, slumped over the neck of a tired horse. Even from a distance, Jonas could see the dark stain on the man's shirt, blood. Behind him, on foot, came a young woman. She was struggling with the terrain, her dress torn and dirty, but she kept pace with the horse, one hand on its flank for support. Jonas watched them approach, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. He assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a man trained for combat. The young man was badly wounded, maybe dying. The woman was exhausted and frightened, but she moved with determination. No weapons visible, no sign of pursuit yet, but the way the woman kept glancing back over her shoulder suggested someone was coming. The horse stumbled the last few yards and stopped near the cabin. The young man tried to dismount but lacked the strength. He slid from the saddle and collapsed onto the hard-packed dirt of Jonas's yard. The woman cried out and dropped to her knees beside him. Jonas stepped out from his position, rifle lowered but not set aside. The woman's head snapped up at the sound of his boots on the ground. Her eyes were dark brown, wide with fear and desperation. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her dark hair falling loose from what had once been a careful braid. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please help him. He's my brother." Jonas approached slowly, his eyes scanning the trail behind them. Still no sign of pursuit, but that didn't mean much. He knelt beside the young man and pulled back his shirt to examine the wound. A bullet had entered just below the ribs on the left side. There was a lot of blood, but the young man was still breathing, though it was shallow and labored. The young man's eyes flickered open. They were the same dark brown as his sister's. He looked up at Jonas with a gaze that held both pain and urgency. "Please," he whispered, barely audible. "Hide my sister!" Jonas met his eyes and saw something there he recognized, the look of a man who knew he was dying but had one last vital thing to accomplish. Jonas had seen that look on battlefields, in the eyes of soldiers who used their final breaths to pass messages or pleas. "Who's after you?" Jonas asked, his voice low and steady. "Tate's men," the young man managed. "Garrison Tate. They're coming." The name meant nothing to Jonas, but the weight the young man put on it told him everything he needed to know. Whoever Tate was, he had power, and he had men willing to kill for him. "Let's get him inside," Jonas said to the woman. He holstered his rifle across his back and carefully lifted the young man. He was lighter than Jonas expected, his body already weakening from blood loss. The woman held the door open, and Jonas carried him into the cabin, laying him gently on the bed, the only bed in the single room. The cabin's interior was as spare as its exterior. A bed, a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves with supplies and a few books. Everything had its place. Everything was clean and maintained. Jonas grabbed a clean cloth and his medical kit, a leather roll containing needles, thread, bandages, and a bottle of whiskey that served as both anesthetic and antiseptic. "What's your name?" Jonas asked the young man as he began cleaning the wound. "Cal," the man said through gritted teeth. "Cal Everett. This is Maria, my sister. I'm Jonas Hale." He worked quickly, his hands steady despite the years since he'd done battlefield surgery. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good in that there was nothing to dig out, but it had likely torn through important things on its way. Cal had lost a lot of blood, and there wasn't much Jonas could do about that, except try to stop the bleeding and hope. Maria stood nearby, wringing her hands. Will he live? Jonas didn't believe in false comfort. Don't know yet. Depends on what got damaged inside and whether infection sets in. He pressed a folded cloth against the wound and secured it with strips of bandage wrapped around Cal's torso. The young man bore it without complaint, though sweat beaded on his pale forehead. When Jonas finished, he gave Cal a healthy dose of whiskey for the pain and to ward off shock. "Tell me what happened," Jonas said, "and make it quick. If men are coming, I need to know what I'm dealing with." Cal's breathing was shallow, but his eyes were clear with urgency. "Our father owned a ranch, small place, about 40 miles southeast of here, near the valley they call Ironwood. Good land, good water. We ran cattle, kept to ourselves. 3 months ago, Garrison Tate made an offer to buy us out. Father refused. Tate owns most of the valley now, bought out or squeezed out everyone else. But Father wouldn't sell." He paused to catch his breath, and Maria took over the story. Her voice was stronger than Jonas expected given the circumstances. Tate sent men. At first it was just threats. They'd ride by the ranch, make comments about accidents that could happen. Then our cattle started disappearing. Then the barn burned. Father reported it to the territorial marshal, but the marshal is in Tate's pocket. Nothing happened. 2 weeks ago, Cal continued, his voice weakening, they came at night. 8 men, maybe more. They shot Father when he tried to defend the ranch. Killed him right there on his own porch. Maria and I ran. We'd hidden horses and supplies, just in case. We've been moving ever since, trying to stay ahead of them. Why do they want you? Jonas asked Maria. She reached into a pocket of her torn dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained with Cal's blood. This. Father wrote it 2 days before he died. He knew they were coming for him. It's a letter describing everything Tate has done. The murders, the thefts, the intimidation. Names, dates, everything. There's also proof in here about why Tate wants the land. Jonas unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky but legible, written by a man who knew his time was short. He read quickly, his jaw tightening as he took in the contents. The letter detailed 3 years of escalating violence by Garrison Tate and his hired men, names of other ranchers who'd been forced out or worse, property destruction, threats against families, and at the end, the reason for all of it. The land sat above an underground aquifer, one of the few reliable water sources in the region. Control the water, control the valley. Control the valley, control everything from cattle to crops to the future of the territory. Attached to the letter with a pin was another document, the original land deed for the Everett ranch, signed and legally recorded. It was proof that the land belonged to the Everetts, not to Tate, no matter what false claims he might have filed. "Father told us to get this to the territorial governor or a federal marshal," Maria said. "Someone outside Tate's influence. But we didn't make it. They caught up to us yesterday at a way station. Cal fought them off while I ran with the horses. He was supposed to follow, but her voice broke. I got shot," Cal finished. "Took 3 of them down first, but 1 got me. I managed to get back to Maria, and we kept riding. We headed up into the mountains, figured they'd have trouble tracking us in the high country. We saw smoke from your chimney this morning. It was the first sign of civilization we'd seen in 2 days. Jonas folded the letter and handed it back to Maria. "How many men were chasing you?" 6, Maria said. "Maybe more by now, if they sent for reinforcements." Jonas walked to the window and looked out at the trail. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. He could see for miles from this vantage point. It was one of the reasons he'd chosen this location. If riders were coming, he'd see them long before they arrived. "Cal needs rest and time to heal," Jonas said. "Time we probably don't have. Those men will follow your trail here. It's only a matter of when, not if." "I know," Maria said quietly. "That's why Cal asked you to hide me. He knows he's dying. He wants me to have a chance." Cal's hand reached out weakly and grasped Jonas's wrist. "Please, I don't care what happens to me. Just keep her safe. Get her away from here. There's a federal marshal in Helena. 2 weeks' ride if you push hard. Get her there with that letter." Jonas looked down at the dying young man. He saw the desperation there, but also the determination. This wasn't a plea born of cowardice. Cal had fought for his family, taken bullets for his sister, and now in his final hours, he was trying to secure her future with his last breath. Jonas had spent 5 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation. He'd come to the mountains to escape responsibility for other people's lives. He'd failed too many men during the war, led them into battles some didn't return from. He'd failed his wife by being too broken to love her properly. He'd built this isolated life specifically to avoid situations where his choices meant life or death for others. But standing here, looking at Cal's fading eyes and Maria's desperate hope, Jonas felt something stir that he'd thought was long dead. Not duty exactly, but something older and deeper. A sense of what was right. These people had been wronged. Their father had been murdered for standing up to a tyrant. They'd fought back as best they could, and now they were here, at his door, with nowhere else to go. He could hide Maria, take her through the high passes he knew so well, avoid the men hunting her, get her to Helena. It would be dangerous, but possible. He'd done similar things during the war. That's what Cal was asking for. That's what any reasonable man would do. But Jonas looked out the window again at the approaching trail and made a different calculation. 6 men, maybe more. Hard men, hired killers willing to murder ranchers and chase down women. If he ran with Maria, they'd follow. The chase would last days, maybe weeks, and eventually, in some mountain pass or valley, they'd catch up. And he'd have to fight them anyway, but on their terms, in terrain they'd choose, or he could make his stand here, now. On ground, he knew intimately, with good sightlines and defensive positions. He could end this today one way or another. More than that, running felt wrong. He'd been running for 5 years, from his past, from his responsibilities, from himself. Maybe it was time to stop. Jonas walked to the far corner of the cabin and reached up to the high shelf. His fingers found the tobacco tin and pulled it down. He opened it and looked at the tarnished medal inside. Congressional Medal of Honor. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. He'd earned it for holding a position against an entire regiment, buying time for wounded men to be evacuated. He remembered that day with perfect clarity, the smoke, the screaming, the weight of the rifle in his hands as he fired again and again. He'd been a different man then, or maybe not. Maybe he'd just been a man doing what needed to be done. Jonas put the medal back in the tin and returned it to the shelf. Then he turned to face Maria and Cal. "I'm not hiding anybody," he said quietly. Maria's face fell, and Cal's grip on the bedsheet tightened. "I'm not hiding you," Jonas continued, "because running won't solve this. They'll just keep coming. But I'll stand with you. When those men arrive, we'll be ready for them." "You don't understand," Maria said. "These aren't ordinary men. They're killers. Tate hires the worst kind. Men who've done things that would get them hanged in civilized places." Jonas met her eyes. "I understand exactly what they are, and they need to understand what I am." He moved to a chest near the door and opened it. Inside were weapons, several rifles, revolvers, boxes of ammunition. He pulled out a custom-built Sharps rifle, longer and heavier than standard issue. He'd used this weapon during the war for long-range work. It could kill a man at distances that seemed impossible. "I spent 4 years fighting men like that," Jonas said, as he began loading weapons and checking their condition. "I know how they think, how they move, how they fight. This cabin is defensible. I've got supplies, ammunition, and high ground. If they want to come for us, let them come. But they're going to pay a price." Cal's eyes had widened. "You're serious?" "I am. You'd do that for people you don't even know." Jonas was quiet for a moment, checking the action on a revolver. "Your father stood up to Tate. He died for it. You fought for your family. Your sister's here because you both did the right thing when it would have been easier to give in. That counts for something. Counts for a lot, actually." He looked at them both. "Besides, I'm tired of running. Been doing it for 5 years. Maybe it's time to make a stand for something that matters." Maria stepped forward. "Then teach me. Teach me to fight. I won't hide behind you or anyone else. This is my family they murdered. My father. If you're going to stand, I stand with you." Jonas studied her face. There was steel there beneath the fear. She meant every word. "All right," he said. "But you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. No hesitation. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then let's get to work. We don't have much time." Night in the high country was a living thing, full of sounds that most people never heard. The wind moving through pine branches made a sound like distant water. Rocks contracted in the cold, with sharp cracks that could make a nervous man jump. Animals moved through the darkness, deer, elk, the occasional mountain lion. Jonas had learned to distinguish between the natural sounds of the wilderness and the unnatural sounds of men trying to move quietly. Tonight, he heard only the wilderness. The 2 men Tate had left behind stayed in their positions, probably under orders to watch and prevent any escape attempt. Jonas could see the faint glow of their small fire, carefully shielded behind rocks. They were maintaining discipline, which told him they were experienced. That would make tomorrow harder. Maria had fallen asleep in the chair, her rifle across her lap, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. Jonas left her that way. She needed the rest, and he could keep watch alone. He'd gone longer than this without sleep during the war. His body remembered how to push through fatigue. Cal's breathing was shallow and irregular. Jonas checked on him once, found his pulse weak and thready. The young man was slipping away. There was nothing more Jonas could do except make him comfortable. He adjusted Cal's blanket and returned to his watch. Around midnight, Maria stirred and woke. She looked disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was. "I fell asleep. I'm sorry." "Don't be. You needed it." Jonas gestured to the bed. "Your brother's still hanging on." Maria moved to Cal's side and took his hand. In the lamplight, Jonas could see how young she really was, barely into her 20s, thrust into circumstances that would break most people. But she hadn't broken. There was strength in her, the kind that came from deep roots. "Tell me about your wife," Maria said quietly, surprising him. Jonas was silent for a moment. He didn't talk about Sarah, hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. But something about the darkness and the waiting made him answer. "Her name was Sarah. We married young, before I understood what war would do to a man." She waited for me while I was fighting. 4 years she waited, keeping our home together, writing me letters that kept me sane. He paused, the memories sharp despite the years. When I came back, I was different, broken in ways I didn't know how to fix. She tried to love me through it, but I was too far gone. The fever took her 2 years after I returned. Part of me wondered if she died of sadness as much as sickness. "I'm sorry," Maria said. "Me too." Jonas turned back to the window. "I came out here thinking if I just got far enough away from everything, I could outrun what I'd become. Turns out you can't outrun yourself. Is that why you decided to help us?" "To stop running." Jonas considered the question. "Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of being alone with ghosts." "At least your ghosts are honest. You know what you're fighting for and why." They sat in companionable silence after that, taking turns watching while the other rested. Around 3 in the morning, Cal woke briefly. His eyes were clearer than they'd been, which Jonas recognized as a bad sign. "Sometimes dying men got a burst of clarity right before the end, Maria," Cal whispered. She was at his side instantly. "I'm here. Remember the summer Father taught us to fish? You caught that big trout and were so proud. I remember. Be that proud of yourself now, of what you're doing, what you've become." Cal's hand found the locket around Maria's neck, the silver one with the photographs. "Keep this safe. Keep the memories safe." "I will." Cal's gaze shifted to Jonas. "Take care of her, please." "I will," Jonas promised. Cal smiled faintly. "Good man." His eyes closed and his breathing grew even shallower. Maria held her brother's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. Jonas stood by the window, giving them space but staying close enough if she needed him. He'd witnessed this scene too many times. The vigil, the waiting, the moment when someone you loved slipped away. Just before dawn, Cal Everett took his last breath. It was quiet, almost peaceful. Maria made a small sound, something between a sob and a sigh, and lowered her head to her brother's chest. Jonas waited, letting her grieve. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. The new day was coming whether they were ready or not. After a while, Maria stood. Her face was wet with tears, but her expression was composed. "We should bury him properly." "We will," Jonas said. "When this is over. For now, we need to prepare." "Those men will be back today," Maria nodded. She went to the wash basin and cleaned her face, then straightened her clothes. When she turned back to Jonas, something had changed in her eyes. The last traces of uncertainty were gone, replaced by a hard determination. "Show me how to reload your pistols," she said. "If they get close, I need to know how to use them." Jonas spent the next hour teaching her the mechanics of the revolvers, how to load the cylinders, how to aim and fire, how to clear a misfire. She learned quickly, her hands steady despite everything. He showed her how to hold the weapon properly, how to brace for the recoil, how to aim for center mass, because trying for fancy shots got people killed. As they worked, Jonas talked about what was coming. When they attack, and they will attack, it's going to be chaos. Smoke, noise, fear. Your mind will want to freeze. Don't let it. Focus on what's right in front of you. One target, one shot, then move to the next. Can you do that? Yes. If they breach the cabin, we fall back to the corner by the stove. It's the most defensible position. We make them come to us one at a time through that narrow space. And if they get past you... Jonas pulled a knife from his belt and handed it to her. It was Cal's hunting knife, cleaned and sharpened. "Then you use this. Aim for the throat or the belly. Don't hesitate." Maria took the knife, tested its weight. "I won't hesitate." Jonas believed her. The sun rose over the eastern peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful, the kind of morning that made you glad to be alive. Jonas wondered if it would be his last. Around 8 o'clock, he spotted dust on the trail below. Riders coming fast. He counted them as they came into view, 12 men, maybe more. They'd brought reinforcements as expected. "They're here," Jonas said quietly. Maria took her position by the window, rifle ready. Her hands were steady. The riders stopped at the same distance as before, just beyond easy rifle range. Jonas recognized the two who'd stayed behind, joining the group. Then the riders parted, and a man rode forward on a magnificent black stallion. Even at this distance, Jonas could tell this was someone different. The man sat his horse with absolute confidence, dressed in expensive clothes that looked out of place in the wilderness. He was older, maybe 50, with a well-trimmed beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "That's Garrison Tate," Maria said, her voice tight with anger. "That's the man who killed my father." Jonas studied Tate through his rifle sights. The cattle baron had brought his son with him, a younger version of Tate, arrogant in his bearing. And riding beside them was another man, harder looking than the rest, with a scarred face and cold eyes. This one moved like a professional, scanning the terrain, assessing angles and distances. "The one with the scars, that's Virgil Cobb," Maria said. "He's Tate's foreman. He's the one who pulled the trigger on father." Jonas filed that information away. Cobb would be the dangerous one, the real threat. Tate was a rich man playing at violence. His son was a fool trying to prove himself. But Cobb was a killer, and killing was what he did. Tate raised his hand, and the group stopped. He produced a white handkerchief and waved it, a flag of truce. "Interesting," Jonas muttered. "He wants to talk." "Don't trust him," Maria said. "I don't trust anyone who murders ranchers and chases down women. But let's hear what he has to say." Jonas stepped out onto the small porch in front of the cabin, his Winchester held casually but ready. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and sage. "That's far enough," Jonas called out. "State your business." Tate's voice carried clearly across the distance. "My business is with the woman, the Everett girl. She has something that belongs to me, and I want it back. She doesn't have anything that belongs to you. She has a letter that describes your crimes, and a deed that proves her family's land is hers, not yours. I see she's been telling tales." Tate's voice was smooth, practiced. "I don't know what lies her father filled her head with, but the truth is simple. I made him a fair offer for his land. He refused. He became unreasonable, even violent. My men had to defend themselves. That's not what the letter says. It lists names, dates, and details of 3 years of murder and theft. It'll hold up in federal court." Tate was quiet for a moment. "Who are you?" "You're not kin to the Everetts. Name's Jonas Hale. And no, I'm not kin. Just a man who doesn't like seeing bullies get away with murder. Jonas Hale." Tate repeated the name thoughtfully. Then his posture changed slightly. Recognition. "Jonas Hale, the ghost, Congressional Medal of Honor. We heard you disappeared after the war." "I did. Found myself a quiet place in the mountains. Until your men showed up. Then you understand how this works. You're a military man. You know about following orders, about chains of command. These are my mountains, Mr. Hale, my territory. I employ half the people in this region. The law answers to me. The marshal answers to me. Even if that girl gets to Helena with her letter, do you think anyone will believe her over me? Federal marshals don't answer to cattle barons. And judges tend to believe documentation." Tate's tone hardened. "You're making a mistake. I'm offering you a way out. Ride away now, and I'll forget you were involved. There might even be compensation for your trouble. But if you continue to interfere, I'll treat you the same as any other obstacle." "The thing about obstacles," Jonas said calmly, "is sometimes they're harder to remove than you expect. I have 15 men down here. How many do you have?" "Just me and the girl. But I've got high ground, clear sight lines, plenty of ammunition, and nothing to lose. How many men are you willing to bury to get what you want?" Virgil Cobb spoke for the first time, his voice rough and direct. "Boss, we're wasting time talking. Let me take 5 men and we'll root them out." But Raymond Tate, the son, laughed mockingly. "One old soldier and a woman? Father, this is embarrassing." "Let me handle it. I'll have them out of there in an hour." Jonas studied the young fool and made his assessment. Arrogant, inexperienced, dangerous in the way that incompetence is dangerous. The kind of man who got other people killed while he played at war. Garrison Tate seemed to be weighing his options. Finally he spoke again. "Last chance, Mr. Hale. I'm a reasonable man, but my patience has limits." "Then you better prepare to lose more men," Jonas replied. "Because we're not coming out, and you're not coming in without paying a price." "So be it." Tate wheeled his horse around and rode back to his men. Jonas returned to the cabin. Maria was pale but determined. "What now?" "Now we see if he's willing to pay the butcher's bill." Jonas checked his weapons one more time.
They'll try to overwhelm us with numbers.
We need to make every shot count and break their momentum before they can organize a proper assault. Through the window, they watched Tate's men dismounting and preparing for attack. Cobb was organizing them into groups, assigning positions. Whatever was about to happen, it would happen soon. Maria touched the locket at her throat, the one with her parents' photographs, then picked up her rifle.
For father.
For Cal. For what's right, Jonas added. The first shots rang out moments later as Tate's men opened fire on the cabin. The attack came with the coordinated precision of men who'd done this before. Cobb had divided them into 3 groups, one to provide covering fire, one to flank from the north, and one to push straight up the middle. It was textbook tactics, the kind that worked against amateurs. Jonas wasn't an amateur. The covering fire was intended to keep Jonas and Maria pinned while the assault teams moved. But Jonas had fought in enough battles to recognize the pattern. He waited, watching through a gap in the shutters he'd partially closed over the windows, tracking movement through the trees and rocks below. Don't return fire yet, he told Maria. Let them commit. The gunfire intensified, bullets thudding into the log walls and whining off the stones of the chimney. It was meant to be intimidating, and it was working on Maria. Jonas could see her flinching with each impact. But the cabin was solid, built to withstand weather and worse. The logs were thick, the chinking sound. They'd need cannon to breach these walls, and all they had were rifles and pistols. Jonas kept his focus on the flanking team, moving through the trees to the north. 5 men moving in a loose skirmish line, using cover well. They were about 200 yards out now, thinking they were concealed by the forest and the covering fire. He brought the Sharp's rifle to his shoulder and sighted carefully. The range was moderate for the big rifle, well within its capabilities. He picked the man on the far left, the one setting the pace for the others, and led him slightly to account for movement. The Sharps boomed, and through the dissipating smoke, Jonas saw the man go down. The others froze, suddenly aware they weren't as concealed as they'd thought. Jonas had already reloaded. He fired again, and another man stumbled and fell. The flanking attack broke. The remaining 3 men scattered, falling back to better cover. Jonas had bought time and broken their momentum. Now, he told Maria, fire on the center group. Don't try to hit them. Just keep their heads down. Maria opened up with her Winchester, working the lever action and firing methodically at the rocks where the covering team was positioned. Her shots weren't accurate at this range, but that wasn't the point. The point was to make them keep their heads down, to make them nervous, to disrupt their rhythm. Jonas shifted his attention to the direct assault team pushing up the middle. These men were bolder, or maybe more desperate. They were using the terrain well, moving from cover to cover, getting closer with each rush. Raymond Tate was with them, shouting encouragement, playing at being a warrior. Jonas let them get to within 100 yards, then opened up with the Winchester. At this range, with clear sight lines, he was deadly. His first shot took down the lead man. His second wounded another. The third made Raymond Tate dive behind a boulder so fast he lost his hat. The assault stalled. Jonas could hear shouting from below. Cobb's voice trying to rally the men, trying to keep the momentum going. But momentum was a fragile thing in combat. Once broken, it was hard to rebuild, especially when men were dying. They're pulling back, Maria said. Her voice breathless. Jonas watched as the attackers retreated to their starting positions, dragging their wounded with them. He counted at least 4 men down, maybe 5. Tate had lost a third of his force in the first assault, and they hadn't gotten within 50 yards of the cabin. Good, Jonas said, but they'll try again. And next time they'll be smarter about it. He reloaded methodically, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Years ago, in the war, this feeling had been as familiar as breathing. The sharp focus, the heightened awareness, the way time seemed to slow during combat. He'd thought he'd left it behind in the mountains. Turned out it had just been waiting below. Jonas could see Garrison Tate gesturing angrily, arguing with Cobb. Even at this distance, the body language was clear. Tate was furious that his overwhelming force hadn't simply rolled over the cabin's defenders. Cobb was trying to explain that overwhelming force didn't mean much when it had to funnel through kill zones against an entrenched defender who knew what he was doing. Raymond Tate was sitting on the ground, looking shaken. His first taste of real violence had apparently been sobering. "They're going to try something different," Jonas said, studying their positions. "Cobb's too smart to just throw men at us again the same way. What will they do? Fire, probably. Wait until dark and try to burn us out. It's the smart play." Jonas looked around the cabin, calculating. "We'll need to be ready to move if they succeed." "Move where?" "There's a cave system about half a mile north of here. I use it for cold storage sometimes. We could hold out there if we had to, though it's not as defensible as the cabin." Maria looked at her brother's still form on the bed. "We can't leave him." "I know. We'll bury him proper when this is done. I promise you that." The afternoon wore on in tense silence. Tate's men made no further attempts to advance, but they didn't leave either. Jonas could see them moving around down there, doing something, but the angles were wrong to get a clear view. Around 3 o'clock, Jonas figured out what they were doing. They were constructing a movable barrier, a wooden framework covered with thick planks that would provide cover as they advanced. It was crude but potentially effective. A few men could push it forward while others fired around it, providing mobile cover for an assault. "Clever," Jonas admitted grudgingly. "Cobb's adapting. Can we stop it?" "Maybe. If I can hit the men behind it, the others won't want to push it forward." Jonas positioned himself at the window with the Sharp's rifle. "But it's going to be tricky shooting." As the sun dropped lower in the sky, Tate's men began their second assault. 4 men pushed the wooden barrier forward, while the others provided covering fire. The barrier was heavy. Jonas could see them straining with the effort, but it was working. They were advancing slowly but steadily up the slope toward the cabin. Jonas waited until they were committed, until they were out in the open, with nowhere to retreat quickly. Then he aimed not at the barrier, but at the ground beneath it, where he could see boots and lower legs. The Sharps boomed. One of the men pushing the barrier screamed and went down. The barrier tilted dangerously. Jonas reloaded and fired again. Another man fell. The barrier collapsed onto its side, no longer providing cover. The assault broke again. The men scattered back to their positions, leaving the barrier lying useless on the slope. Jonas heard Tate shouting, his voice carrying on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, fury and frustration. The cattle baron was learning that money and power didn't mean much when you were the one being shot at. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Maria asked. Jonas did a quick inventory. "Enough for another day, maybe 2 if we're careful. But we're not going to be here that long. Either they'll give up and leave, or they'll find a way to force us out. Which do you think they'll do?" Jonas looked down at where Tate was pacing back and forth, gesturing angrily. "He's invested too much now, money, men, pride. He can't walk away without losing face. So he'll find a way, or he'll die trying." As if in response to Jonas's prediction, he saw Cobb gathering a group of men and pointing toward the west. Jonas shifted position to get a better view and felt his stomach tighten. They were moving toward the creek, the source of the cabin's water. "They're going to cut off our water," Jonas said. "Or poison it." Maria's eyes widened. "Can they do that?" "If they get to the creek upstream of us, yes. They can foul it or divert it. Without water, we can't hold out more than a few days," Jonas calculated quickly. They had perhaps 2 days' worth of water in the containers inside the cabin. After that, they'd have to either break out or surrender. He watched as 6 men made their way carefully toward the creek, using the terrain and the fading light to conceal their movement. Jonas could take some of them out, but not all 6 before they reached the water. And once they were there, dislodging them would be nearly impossible without leaving the cabin's protection. "We've got a problem," Jonas said quietly. Before he could elaborate, he heard a new sound, horses approaching from the south. For a moment he thought it was more reinforcements for Tate. But then he saw only 2 riders, and they were coming fast, pushing their horses hard. The riders swept into Tate's camp, and Jonas could see heated conversation, lots of gesturing. One of the riders was waving a piece of paper. After a few minutes, Garrison Tate stalked over to where Cobb was organizing the creek operation and called him back. "Something's happening," Maria said. Jonas watched through his rifle scope, trying to make sense of the scene below. Whatever news the riders had brought, it had changed Tate's plans. The cattle baron was arguing with Cobb, who was shaking his head. Raymond Tate joined the conversation, and it became more heated. Finally, Tate gestured sharply, and his men began pulling back, consolidating into a defensive perimeter. The operation against the creek was abandoned. "They're stopping," Maria said, confused. "Why are they stopping?" Jonas didn't lower his rifle. "Don't know yet. Could be a trick. Could be they're waiting for dark. Could be something else entirely." They waited as the sun set and darkness fell over the mountains. Tate's men built fires and settled into what looked like a siege camp. No more attacks came. Jonas maintained watch, suspicious of the sudden change in tactics. Around midnight, Maria came to stand beside him at the window. "Do you think they'll give up? Just leave?" "Men like Tate don't give up. They just change strategies." Jonas kept his gaze on the fires below. "Something changed today. Those riders brought news that made Tate pause. I don't know what it was, but we need to use whatever time it bought us. To do what?" Jonas turned to look at her. "To make sure if they do break through, that letter and deed get out. Someone needs to know the truth about what Tate's done." Maria touched the locket at her throat again, then pulled out the blood-stained papers from where she'd kept them tucked inside her dress. "Cal died for these. Father died for these. I'm not giving them up. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying we need a backup plan. If things go bad, one of us needs to get out with those documents. We could both run. Tonight, while they're settled in camp," Jonas considered it. The tactical part of his mind calculated routes, distances, pursuit times. They could slip away in the darkness, use his knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of pursuit. They might even make it, but the same part of his mind that had kept him alive through 4 years of war told him that running now would just postpone the inevitable. Tate would hunt them. He had the resources, the men, and now apparently a personal stake in seeing this through. Better to end it here on ground Jonas knew and controlled. "We could run," Jonas agreed. "But I think we've got a better play." "What?" Jonas smiled grimly. "We go on the offensive. Stop reacting to what they do and make them react to us." Maria stared at him. "There are still 12 or 13 of them down there, and 2 of us up here. How do we go on the offensive?" "Same way I survived the war. We don't fight fair. We don't fight by their rules. And we hit them where they don't expect it." Jonas moved to his equipment chest and began pulling out items, rope, knives, his war journal filled with tactical notes and sketches. "During the war, I specialized in raids behind enemy lines. Small force, high impact, psychological warfare. We're going to use the same principles." He opened the journal to a page filled with diagrams and notes, sketches of ambush points and raid tactics. "We make them afraid to sleep. We make them doubt each other. We make them want to leave more than they want to stay." Maria looked at the journal, at the careful notes written in Jonas's precise hand. She saw dates from the war, mission reports, casualty counts. This was the work of Jonas the Ghost, the warrior he'd tried to leave behind. "When do we start?" she asked. "Tonight. While they think we're pinned down and defensive." Jonas closed the journal and met her eyes. "But I need you to understand something. What I'm planning, it's not clean, it's not honorable by regular standards. It's guerrilla warfare, the kind of fighting that leaves marks on your soul. They murdered my father," Maria said flatly. "They shot my brother. They've killed good people for money and land. I'm not worried about my soul right now." Jonas nodded slowly. He recognized that hardness in her voice. He'd heard it in his own voice once, years ago, when he'd crossed a line and decided that winning mattered more than maintaining his illusions about war being noble. "All right then, here's what we're going to do." The plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. Jonas would leave the cabin under cover of darkness, circle around Tate's camp, and create enough chaos to make them think they were under attack from multiple directions. Meanwhile, Maria would maintain a presence in the cabin, firing occasionally to make it seem both defenders were still inside. The key is timing, Jonas explained as he prepared his equipment. He blackened his face with ash from the stove, tied back his hair, and dressed in dark clothing. I'll be gone for maybe 2 hours. You keep watch. Fire a shot every 15 minutes or so at different windows. Make them think we're both still here. What if they attack while you're gone? They won't. They're settled in for the night. Gob's too smart to launch a night assault without preparation, and I didn't see any signs they were preparing. Jonas checked his revolvers, making sure each cylinder was fully loaded. But if something does happen, you fall back to the cave system. You know the route I showed you. Yes, take the letter and deed. That's what matters. Jonas moved to the door, then paused. Maria, if I don't come back, you'll come back, she interrupted firmly. You're Jonas the ghost. You don't get caught. Jonas smiled at her confidence, though he knew better than to assume anything in combat. Keep that thought. I'll see you in a few hours. He slipped out into the night, moving with the practiced silence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to see by, but not enough to make him easily visible. Perfect conditions for what he had planned. Jonas worked his way down the slope, staying off the main trail, using the rocks and trees for concealment. His body remembered the old rhythms, how to place his feet to avoid snapping twigs, how to move fluidly from cover to cover, how to become part of the landscape. It took him 40 minutes to circle around to a position northeast of Tate's camp. He could see their fires, hear their voices carrying on the night air. They'd posted sentries, but the guards were watching the cabin, not the surrounding forest. They expected any attack to come from above, not from behind. Jonas counted the men visible around the fires. 11, not counting the sentries. 2 men were missing, either dead or badly wounded from the earlier fighting. The group was smaller now, more manageable, but still dangerous. He found what he was looking for, the rope corral where they'd penned the horses. A dozen animals tied and hobbled for the night. Jonas smiled grimly. Take away a man's horse in this country, and you took away his confidence. Moving like a shadow, Jonas approached the corral from downwind so the horses wouldn't spook at his scent. He worked quickly and quietly, cutting ropes, removing hobbles. The horses shifted nervously but didn't bolt. Not yet. Then Jonas moved to where the men had stacked their extra ammunition and supplies. He placed small charges of black powder he'd brought from the cabin, set with slow-burning fuses. Nothing fancy, just enough to create confusion and destroy supplies. He was backing away from the supply cache when he heard a voice close by. Thought I heard something out here. Jonas froze. A sentry had wandered away from his post, probably to relieve himself. The man was standing 20 feet away, his rifle held loosely, peering into the darkness. Jonas had 2 choices: try to remain hidden and hope the man went away, or eliminate the threat. The old instincts from the war kicked in, making the decision for him. He couldn't risk being discovered before the charges went off. He moved swiftly and silently, closing the distance before the sentry could register his presence. Jonas's hand clamped over the man's mouth while his other arm went around his throat, cutting off air and blood flow. The sentry struggled briefly, then went limp. Jonas lowered him quietly to the ground and tied him securely with the man's own belt and bandana. Not dead, but he'd be unconscious for a while. Jonas heard voices from the camp, someone wondering where the sentry had gone. He needed to move now. He struck a match and lit the fuses, then slapped the nearest horse on the rump. The animal bolted, and that started the others. Suddenly, a dozen horses were stampeding through the camp, panicked and wild. Men shouted in alarm, diving out of the way, trying to catch the fleeing animals. In the confusion, Jonas's charges detonated, not large explosions, but enough to destroy the ammunition cache and set fire to their supplies. The camp erupted into chaos. Men were running in all directions, some chasing horses, others trying to put out fires. Everyone shouting questions and contradictory orders. Jonas fired 2 shots from his revolver into the air, then moved quickly to a new position and fired twice more from a different angle. The shots came from the forest, making it seem like multiple attackers were surrounding the camp. Virgil Cobb's voice cut through the confusion, trying to restore order. "It's a raid! Form up!" defensive positions. But it was too late. The horses were scattered, the supplies were burning, and the men were spooked. Jonas melted back into the forest, moving swiftly now, putting distance between himself and the chaos he'd created. Behind him, he heard more gunfire as Tate's men shot at shadows, their nerves frayed. Jonas smiled. They'd be jumping at every sound for the rest of the night. Exhausted and rattled by morning, he made his way back to the cabin, approaching carefully and giving the signal he'd arranged with Maria. 3 stones tossed against the door in quick succession. The door opened immediately and he slipped inside. It worked? Maria asked. Better than I hoped. Their horses are scattered, their supplies are burning, and they're convinced they're surrounded. Jonas moved to the window and looked down at the camp. Even from this distance, he could see the fires and hear the shouting. They won't sleep tonight, and tired, rattled men make mistakes. Maria allowed herself a small smile. My father would have approved. Jonas cleaned the ash from his face and reloaded his weapons. The next part is waiting. Let them stew in it. Let them realize that this isn't going to be the easy job they thought it was. As dawn approached, Jonas and Maria took turns keeping watch. Below, Tate's camp was a scene of controlled chaos. Men were trying to round up horses, salvage what they could of their supplies, and maintain some kind of defensive perimeter. Several men were mounted and searching the surrounding forest, but Jonas had covered his tracks well. Around 8 in the morning, Jonas saw Garrison Tate himself storming around the camp, clearly furious. He was shouting at Cobb, who stood with his arms crossed, taking the abuse, but not looking particularly concerned. Raymond Tate sat by one of the fires, his earlier bravado completely gone. He looked exhausted and frightened, as he should be. This wasn't a game anymore, if it ever had been. Jonas watched as Cobb gathered the remaining men and began issuing orders. Whatever they were planning next, it would be more cautious, more thought out. Good, that meant more time. What now? Maria asked. Now we make them an offer, Jonas said. Give them a way out that doesn't involve more dying. You think they'll take it? Some of them might. The hired guns are in this for money, not loyalty. If they realize the price is too high, they'll walk away. Jonas moved to the door. I'm going to talk to them. Is that safe? Probably not. But neither is waiting here for them to figure out their next move. Jonas picked up a white cloth and tied it to a stick, a makeshift flag of truce. Stay here and keep me covered. If they shoot at me, kill as many as you can. Jonas, I'll be fine. They've done this before, too. He stepped out onto the porch, holding the white flag high. Below, men reached for weapons, but Cobb shouted something and they held their fire. Jonas's voice carried across the distance. I want to talk to Garrison Tate. Just talk. No shooting. There was a long pause. Then Tate himself strode forward, stopping at the base of the slope. Cobb was beside him, hand resting on his pistol. You've got nerve, I'll give you that, Tate called out. Raiding my camp in the middle of the night. You're the one who brought an army to my mountain, Jonas replied. I'm just defending my home. Your home? Tate laughed bitterly. You've been here, 5 years? I've been building this territory for 20. It's mine by right of work and investment. Nothing gives you the right to murder people for their land. Careful with accusations you can't prove. The letter proves it. Tate's names, witnesses. It'll hold up in federal court, and you know it. Tate was silent for a moment. What do you want, Hale? I want you to leave. Pack up what's left of your men and go. Let the Everett girl pass safely to Helena with her evidence. Let the law sort it out, and if I refuse, then we keep doing what we've been doing. You keep losing men and supplies until you either give up or run out of both. Jonas gestured to the camp. You've lost 1/3 of your force already. How many more are you willing to bury? Cobb spoke for the first time. He's not wrong, boss. This isn't worth it. Cut your losses. Tate whirled on his foreman. I don't pay you to give up. You pay me to win. And this, Cobb gestured at the cabin, this isn't winning. This is bleeding men and money for nothing. It's not nothing. If that letter reaches Helena, everything I've built falls apart. Everything. The desperation in Tate's voice told Jonas everything he needed to know. The cattle baron wasn't just fighting to cover up past crimes. He was fighting to protect a larger scheme, something that would unravel if the truth came out. What else is in that letter? Jonas called out. What aren't you telling your men? Tate's face reddened. None of your damned business. But Jonas had struck a nerve, and he pressed. Your men deserve to know what they're dying for. Is it just about water rights? Or is there something bigger? Several of Tate's men were looking at each other now, questioning. The seed of doubt had been planted. Get back in your hole, Hale, Tate snarled. This conversation is over. The offer stands, Jonas said. Leave now, and no more men have to die. The only one who's going to die is you and that girl. I'll bring 50 men if I have to. 100. Whatever it takes, Jonas shook his head. You do that, and you'll just be giving me more targets. Think about it, Tate. Think hard. He turned and walked back to the cabin, aware that a dozen rifles were trained on his back. But no shots came. Cobb wouldn't allow it during a truce, even if Tate wanted to. Inside, Maria lowered her rifle. That didn't go well. Actually, it went exactly as I hoped. I planted doubt in the hired guns' minds, made them wonder what they're really fighting for. And I confirmed that there's more to this than just covering up murders. What do you mean? Jonas moved to the table where the letter lay. He read through it again, more carefully this time, looking for what he'd missed before. Then he saw it, a single line near the end that he'd glossed over in his first reading. Railroad, he said softly. Your father mentions rumors of a railroad coming through this territory. So, if Tate knows the railroad route before it's announced, and he owns all the land along that route, he stands to make millions, maybe tens of millions. Jonas looked at Maria. That's what this is really about. Not water, not cattle. Land speculation on a massive scale. Maria's eyes widened. That's why he's so desperate. If the truth comes out before he secures all the land, the railroad company will investigate. They'll refuse to deal with him. Exactly. And that means he can't afford to let us reach Helena with this information. Jonas walked back to the window. He'll come at us again, soon, and this time he won't hold back. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the next assault. Jonas knew it would come. Probably at dusk, when the light was tricky and the attackers could use the shadows to conceal their approach. He was right. As the sun dropped toward the western peaks, Tate's men began moving again. But this time they weren't trying to assault the cabin directly. They were spreading out, surrounding it from all sides. They're going to try to burn us out, Jonas said. Wait until full dark, then light fires all around the cabin. Force us to either burn or run out into the open. Can we stop them? Maybe, if we can pick off enough of them before they get the fires started. Jonas positioned his rifles at different windows. This is it, Maria. The real fight. You ready? Maria checked her weapons one more time, then nodded. Ready. As darkness fell, the first torches were lit below. The torches flickered like malevolent fireflies in the darkness, spreading out in a loose circle around the cabin. Jonas counted at least 8 of them, maybe more hidden in the shadows. Tate was committing everything to this assault. No more probing attacks, no more testing defenses. This was the final push. They'll try to get close under cover of darkness, then throw the torches onto the roof, Jonas said, his voice calm despite the stakes. We need to stop them before they get within throwing distance. He handed Maria one of his revolvers, along with her rifle. If they breach the cabin, use this. And remember what I taught you about the knife. Maria nodded, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. She touched Cal's hunting knife at her belt, then moved to her assigned window. Jonas positioned himself at the front window with the Sharp's rifle. The range was tricky in the darkness, but the torches gave away the positions of Tate's men. They thought the light would help them see their target. Instead, it made them targets. The first shot from the Sharps boomed through the night. One of the torches went flying as the man carrying it fell. The others immediately dropped their lights and dove for cover, but Jonas had already marked their positions. He fired twice more with the Winchester, forcing them to stay down. Maria opened fire from her window, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating her focused face. She was firing at shadows and movement, keeping the attackers off balance, but Tate had learned from his earlier failures. While some men provided the distraction with torches, others were moving in the darkness without lights, approaching from multiple directions. Jonas heard sounds from the north side of the cabin, footsteps, whispered commands. "North side," he called to Maria. "At least 3 of them." Maria swung her rifle around and fired through the shuttered window. Someone cursed in pain, and Jonas heard scrambling as men retreated. Then came the sound of breaking glass. Something crashed through the east window, a torch wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. It landed on the floor, flames spreading quickly across the old wood. "Fire!" Maria shouted. Jonas grabbed a bucket of water they'd prepared and doused the flames. The torch hissed and went out, but the damage was done. The floorboards were scorched and smoke filled the cabin. Another torch came through the same window, then a third through the back. Jonas and Maria worked frantically, putting out fires while trying to maintain defensive positions. It was exactly what Tate wanted: divide their attention, create chaos, then strike. Jonas heard boots on the porch. Someone was at the front door. He spun and fired through the wood, heard a scream, and the footsteps retreated. But more were coming. The cabin was surrounded now, men closing in from all sides. "The roof," Maria said, pointing up. "They're on the roof." Jonas could hear them now, footsteps above, the sound of men positioning themselves. Then fire began dripping through gaps in the cedar shakes. They were pouring oil down and lighting it. "We have to go," Jonas said. "Now. The cave system, it's our only chance." He grabbed the essential supplies he'd already packed: ammunition, water, some food. Maria took the letter and deed, securing them inside her dress. She cast one last look at Cal's body on the bed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He'd understand," Jonas said. "Come on." He led her to the back corner of the cabin, where a small root cellar accessed through a trapdoor led to a tunnel he'd dug years ago. An escape route he'd prepared but never thought he'd need. They descended into the darkness as flames began to consume the cabin above. The tunnel was narrow and low, barely wide enough to crawl through. Jonas went first with a lantern, Maria close behind. Behind them, they could hear shouts of triumph as Tate's men realized the cabin was burning. The tunnel ran north for about 100 yards, emerging in a ravine hidden by thick brush. Jonas pushed through carefully, checking for guards. The attention was all focused on the burning cabin. No one was watching the surrounding forest. "This way," Jonas whispered. "Stay low and quiet." They moved through the darkness, putting distance between themselves and the burning cabin. Jonas led them on a winding route through terrain he knew intimately, over rocky outcrops that wouldn't hold tracks, through streams that would wash away their scent, past landmarks only he knew. After an hour of steady movement, they reached the cave system Jonas had mentioned. The entrance was concealed behind a waterfall, a narrow gap in the rock that you wouldn't notice unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the cave opened into a larger chamber. Jonas had stocked it over the years with supplies: blankets, preserved food, spare ammunition. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dry and defensible. Maria sank down against the stone wall, exhausted and shaking. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the attack was fading, leaving her drained. "Rest," Jonas said. "We're safe here for now. How long before they find us?" "Hard to say. In daylight they could track us, but I covered our trail as well as I could. And they'll probably assume we died in the fire, at least at first." Jonas checked his weapons, reloading what he'd fired. "We've bought ourselves some time." Maria pulled out the letter and deed, checking to make sure they were undamaged. "All of this, everything Cal and Father fought for, it comes down to these pieces of paper. Information is power. Those papers can bring down Tate's entire operation." Jonas settled against the opposite wall. "But first we need to figure out how to get them to Helena. Can we make it? Just the 2 of us on foot. It's 2 weeks of hard travel, maybe more without horses, and Tate will be hunting us the whole way." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "But I've made harder journeys." They sat in silence, listening to the sound of the waterfall outside and their own breathing. The cave was cold, but the blankets helped. Maria wrapped herself in one, still shivering. "Tell me something," she said after a while. "Why did you really help us?" "The truth." Jonas considered the question. He could give her the easy answer, that it was the right thing to do, that he couldn't stand by and watch innocent people be murdered. All of that was true. But there was more to it. I spent 5 years running from who I was, he said finally. From the things I'd done, the man I'd become during the war. I thought, if I could just get far enough away, high enough in the mountains, I could leave it all behind. But you can't run from yourself. You just carry it with you. And we changed that. You reminded me that the skills I have, the things I learned how to do, they're not inherently evil. It's what you use them for that matters. During the war, I killed men because politicians and generals told me to, for causes I didn't always understand or believe in. But here now, I'm fighting for something clear, something that matters. Maria was quiet, absorbing his words. My father used to say that a man's character isn't defined by what he's done, but by what he does next. Your father was a wise man? He was. And he'd be grateful to you for protecting his daughter. Maria pulled the blanket tighter. Jonas, what happens if we don't make it? If Tate catches us before we reach Helena? Then we make sure the information survives even if we don't. Jonas pulled out paper and a pencil from his pack. We make copies of the key parts of that letter. Hide them in different places along our route. If something happens to us, maybe someone else will find them eventually. That's grim thinking. That's practical thinking. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. Jonas began carefully copying the most damning parts of the letter by lamplight. Tomorrow, we'll need to scout their positions, figure out where they're searching. We can't move during the day. Too easy to spot. But once night falls, we put distance between us and them. And then? Then we head for Helena. Stay in the high country where they can't use numbers against us. Move at night, hide during the day. It'll be slow and it'll be hard, but it's our best chance. Maria watched him work, his weathered hands moving steadily across the page, despite the poor light. You know what you remind me of? Those old stories about knights. The ones who'd champion people who had no other defender. Jonas snorted. Knights had honor and nobility. I'm just a man who's killed too many people trying to figure out how to be something other than a killer. Maybe that's what makes you different. Real knights probably struggled with the same things. They just didn't write about it in the stories. Jonas finished the copy and tucked it carefully into a waterproof pouch. Get some sleep. I'll take first watch. We've got a long road ahead of us. Maria settled against the cave wall, wrapped in the blanket. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her and she was asleep. Jonas sat by the entrance, watching the darkness beyond the waterfall. His cabin was gone. The home he'd built with his own hands, the sanctuary where he'd tried to outrun his demons. Everything he'd owned in the world had been in that cabin, and now it was ashes. But somehow he didn't feel the loss as keenly as he'd expected. The cabin had been a prison as much as a refuge. And maybe that's what he'd needed, to have it taken away, to be forced back into the world, to remember what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd tried to build. She'd wanted him to be something he couldn't be, a normal man with a normal life, untouched by war and violence. He'd failed her because he'd been trying to pretend he was someone he wasn't. But Maria didn't need him to be normal. She needed him to be exactly what he was, a warrior, a protector, someone who knew how to survive when civilization's rules no longer applied. Maybe that was its own kind of redemption. As dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the waterfall, Jonas heard sounds in the distance, men calling to each other, searching. Tate hadn't given up. He was hunting them, and he wouldn't stop until he had the letter or until Jonas stopped him permanently. Jonas checked his weapons one more time. The Sharp's rifle, 2 revolvers, Cal's hunting knife. Not much against however many men Tate could muster. But Jonas had learned long ago that determination and skill often mattered more than numbers. The hunt was on, and this time Jonas wasn't running. He was leading them exactly where he wanted them to go. He pulled out his war journal and began sketching the terrain between here and Helena, marking ambush points and defensive positions. If Tate wanted a hunt, Jonas would give him one. But the cattle baron might discover too late that he was chasing a hunter, not prey. Maria stirred as the sun rose, blinking awake in the dim cave light. They're still out there? Yes, searching systematically. They'll find this cave eventually. Jonas closed the journal. But not today. Today we rest and plan. Tonight we move. Where? Jonas pointed to a mark on his sketched map. There's a narrow canyon about 10 miles north, called Devil's Gate by the trappers who know it. The walls are steep, the passage narrow. If we can get there ahead of them, we can hold off an army with just the two of us. And after that we keep moving. Keep them chasing us through the high country until we either lose them or thin their numbers enough to make a break for Helena. Jonas met her eyes. It's going to be hard, Maria. Harder than anything you've done so far. Can you do it? Maria thought of her father, murdered on his own porch, of Cal dying to save her, of everything that had been taken from her family by a man who thought power and money made him untouchable. I can do it, she said. Whatever it takes. Jonas nodded. Then let's make sure Garrison Tate regrets the day he decided to cross the Everett family. The sun climbed toward midday, turning Devil's Gate into an oven of reflected heat from the stone walls. Jonas and Maria maintained their positions, conserving energy, sipping water sparingly. Jonas had learned patience in the war, the ability to wait hours or even days for the right moment. He taught Maria to do the same, to settle into stillness, to make herself comfortable enough to endure. Around noon, Jonas spotted the first scout. A lone rider appeared on the ridge to the south, silhouetted against the sky. The man was studying the canyon through a spyglass, taking his time, being thorough. He spotted the canyon, Jonas whispered. Probably wondering if we're inside. The scout disappeared, riding back the way he'd come. Jonas knew what would happen next. The scout would report to Cobb or Tate. They'd discuss options, then they'd approach carefully. Good. More time for Jonas and Maria to prepare. How will they come at us? Maria asked. Jonas studied the terrain with a tactician's eye. And they'll send men around to seal off the far end of the canyon, make sure we can't slip out the back. Then they'll probe the entrance, test our defenses. When they realize we're here and dug in, they'll have a choice. Try to force their way through or wait us out. And if they wait, then we've bought time. Every hour we keep them here is an hour we're not running. An hour their supplies dwindle, an hour their men get more tired and frustrated. Jonas shifted his position slightly. Sieges favor the defender, as long as the defender has supplies. We've got water from the stream running through the canyon, and enough food for several days. They're the ones burning resources. An hour later, riders appeared, 8 men led by Virgil Cobb himself. They approached the canyon entrance cautiously, spreading out, using cover. Professional work. These men had learned from their earlier mistakes, Cobb called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Hale, I know you're in there. Let's talk like reasonable men. Jonas considered not responding, but information worked both ways. Sometimes you could learn as much from a conversation as from watching. I'm listening, Cobb. You've made your point. You're a dangerous man, and we've lost good people underestimating you. But this doesn't have to end with more dying. That's up to Tate. He's the one who started this. The girl has something that belongs to Mr. Tate. Return it, and everyone can walk away. She has evidence of murder and land theft. That doesn't belong to Tate. It belongs in a courtroom. There was a pause. Then Cobb said, I'm going to be straight with you, Hale. I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've seen how these things end. Tate has unlimited resources. He can bring in 50 men, 100 if he needs to. Eventually you'll run out of ammunition or supplies or luck. Why die for people you barely know? Jonas appreciated the honesty, even if he didn't agree with the conclusion. Because it's the right thing to do. You understand that, Cobb. I can hear it in your voice. You're a professional, not a murderer. How many innocent people have to die before you draw a line? Another pause, longer this time. I draw my line where my paycheck is. Everything else is philosophy. Philosophy matters when you're the one doing the killing. Ask yourself what you're going to tell yourself 10 years from now about the things you did for Garrison Tates. Money, pretty words from a man with a Medal of Honor, but medals don't mean much when you're dead. Cobb's tone hardened. Last chance. Send out the girl and the papers. You can walk away. No deal. Then I'll do what I'm paid to do. Cobb and his men withdrew out of rifle range. Jonas watched them go, knowing the next time they appeared, it would be to attack. He seems different from the others, Maria said. less vicious. He's a professional. Does a job, gets paid, doesn't make it personal. But that doesn't make him any less dangerous. Maybe more so, because he won't make mistakes based on emotion. Jonas checked his ammunition. Men like Cobb are the hardest to fight because they're competent and they don't quit. As afternoon wore on, Jonas saw more riders arriving. Reinforcements, just as he'd expected. By his count, Tate now had at least 20 men at the canyon entrance. Too many to fight head-on, but in this narrow space, numbers didn't matter as much as position. The attack came at dusk, just as Jonas predicted. 6 men tried to rush the canyon entrance while the others provided covering fire. But the narrow opening meant they could only come 3 abreast at most, and Jonas was ready. The Sharp's rifle spoke first, its heavy boom echoing like thunder. The lead man went down. Jonas worked the breech, loaded, and fired again. Another man fell. The third shot sent the rest scrambling back, the assault broken before it really began. Maria had been firing too, her Winchester cracking steadily, forcing men to cover. She was learning quickly, picking her targets, conserving ammunition. Good shooting, Jonas said. Keep them honest. The attackers tried twice more before full darkness, each time with the same result. The canyon entrance was a killing field, and Jonas commanded it absolutely. Tate was learning an expensive lesson about the value of defensive terrain. As night fell, Jonas heard angry voices from the attackers' camp. They were arguing, their frustration evident even at this distance. Good, frustrated men made mistakes. "We should eat something," Jonas said. "Keep our strength up." They shared dried meat and hardtack, washing it down with cold water from the canyon stream. The food was plain but sufficient. Jonas had learned in the war that a soldier's effectiveness depended on maintaining basic needs: food, water, rest. Neglect those, and skill didn't matter. "Do you think they'll try again tonight?" Maria asked. "Probably not. Cobb's too smart to waste men on night assaults when we hold the defensive position. They'll wait for morning, try something different." Jonas settled back against the rock. "Get some sleep. I'll keep watch. Wake me in a few hours." "You need rest, too," Jonas nodded, though he doubted he'd wake her. She needed the rest more than he did, and his body was used to operating on minimal sleep. The night passed quietly, the attackers content to maintain their siege. Jonas used the time to think through scenarios, planning for various approaches they might try. Around 3 in the morning he heard horses, several riders leaving the area, heading south. Interesting. Either they were going for more supplies, or Tate was trying something else. Jonas made a mental note to be extra vigilant. Dawn came with surprising beauty, the sun painting the canyon walls in brilliant oranges and reds. Jonas woke Maria gently, and they ate a quick breakfast while watching for movement. "Something's changed," Jonas said. "They pulled men out during the night. Maybe they're giving up? Maybe. Or maybe they're trying to flank us, come in from the back of the canyon." Jonas moved to check their rear positions. The canyon ran for about a mile before opening into a wider valley. If Tate sent men around to approach from that direction, they'd be caught between 2 forces. "We need to scout the back," Jonas decided. "You hold this position. I'll move through the canyon and make sure no one's coming up behind us. Is that safe?" Safer than being surprised. Jonas took his Winchester and several loaded revolvers. "If you hear shooting from deeper in the canyon, fall back to the second defensive position we set up. Don't try to come help me. Just hold the line here." Maria didn't like it, but she understood the necessity. "Be careful." Jonas moved through Devil's Gate, using the rocks and shadows for concealment. The canyon floor was treacherous with loose stones and hidden crevices, but he navigated it with the ease of long practice. About halfway through, he heard voices ahead, men approaching from the far end of the canyon. So Tate had sent a flanking force after all. Jonas counted at least 6 riders coming through the wider valley toward the narrow canyon. He found a position among the boulders and waited. The riders entered the canyon cautiously, aware they were in a vulnerable position but confident in their numbers. They were talking quietly, working out their approach. Jonas recognized one voice, Raymond Tate, the cattle baron's son. The young fool had been given command of this flanking force, probably to let him prove himself. "Keep sharp," Raymond was saying. Father says the ghost is dangerous, but he's just one man. 6 of us should be more than enough. Jonas let them get deeper into the canyon. Let them commit. Then he fired. The Sharp's rifle's boom was amplified by the canyon walls, sounding like artillery. Raymond's horse went down, throwing its rider. Jonas fired again, dropping another horse. The confined space worked against the riders. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't use their numbers effectively. Jonas moved to a new position, while the riders scrambled for cover. He fired twice more with his revolvers, not trying for kills, but creating chaos, making them afraid to move. Raymond was shouting orders, his voice cracking with panic. His men were veterans enough to know they were in a bad tactical position, but trapped between loyalty to their employer's son and self-preservation, Jonas fired again, and one of the riders decided he'd had enough. The man spurred his horse and rode hard back the way they'd come. Another followed, then a third. Raymond screamed at them to hold position, but fear was contagious. Within minutes, the flanking force had retreated, leaving Raymond with just 2 men. The young Tate was shouting threats after his departed riders, his face red with humiliation and rage. Jonas could have killed all 3 of them easily from his concealed position. But he'd made his point. The canyon was indefensible for attackers from either direction. He let them retreat, carrying the message back to Garrison Tate that his son's assault had failed as completely as every other attempt. Jonas returned to the front entrance where Maria was maintaining her position. They tried to flank us. It didn't work. I heard the shooting. Was it bad? Broken their momentum again. Scattered their forces. This siege is costing Tate more than he bargained for. Jonas allowed himself a tired smile. He's running out of options. By midday, the situation at Devil's Gate had reached a stalemate. Tate's forces surrounded the canyon, but couldn't push through without suffering casualties they were increasingly unwilling to accept. Jonas and Maria held a position that was nearly unassailable, but couldn't leave without fighting through superior numbers. Jonas was studying the enemy, camped through his spyglass when he noticed unusual activity. Men were gathering around Garrison Tate, and there appeared to be a heated argument. Cobb stood off to one side, his body language suggesting disagreement with whatever was being discussed. "Something's happening," Jonas said. "Some kind of dispute in their ranks." Maria moved to where she could see. "Can you tell what they're arguing about?" "Not from here, but based on Cobb's posture, I'd say he's advising retreat and Tate isn't listening." Jonas lowered the spyglass. "The longer this goes on, the more Tate's men will question whether the pay is worth the cost." As if to confirm Jonas's assessment, 3 riders suddenly broke from the group and headed south at a gallop. They weren't scouts, they were deserters, men who'd decided that whatever Tate was paying wasn't worth dying for. Tate was gesturing angrily, shouting at the departing riders. Cobb moved closer to his employer, clearly trying to calm him down. But Garrison Tate seemed to be coming apart, the careful control he'd maintained, crumbling under the weight of repeated failures. "He's losing his men," Maria said. "They're giving up, some of them. But Tate still has enough to be dangerous, and desperate men do desperate things." Jonas turned to Maria. "We need to be ready for one final push. He's going to try something reckless." The attack came an hour later, but not in the way Jonas expected. Instead of trying to force the canyon entrance again, Tate's remaining men, Jonas counted about a dozen, began firing systematically into the canyon. Not trying to hit anything, just sending a continuous stream of bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. "They're trying to make the canyon uninhabitable," Jonas realized. "Force us out through sheer volume of fire." The bullets whined and sparked off the rocks around them. Maria pressed herself flat against the stone, covering her head as fragments of rock flew like shrapnel. The noise was tremendous, overwhelming, designed to terrify and demoralize. Jonas assessed the situation quickly. They couldn't stay here. Sooner or later, a ricochet would find them. But leaving cover meant exposing themselves to direct fire. He needed to change the dynamic, force Tate's men to stop shooting and start defending. "Stay here and stay down," Jonas told Maria. He pulled out Cal's hunting knife and handed it to her. "If anyone gets past me, use this. Aim for the throat or belly. Where are you going?" "To end this," Jonas checked his revolvers one final time. "When the shooting stops, get to the rear position and wait for me. If I don't come back in an hour, take the papers and head for Helena." "Follow the route we mapped." "Jonas, no." But he was already moving, using the covering fire's chaos to mask his own movement. Jonas worked his way along the canyon wall, using every scrap of cover, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times. He reached a position near the canyon entrance where he could see Tate's men. They were focused on maintaining their barrage, confident that volume of fire would drive Jonas and Maria out. None of them were watching their flanks. Jonas slipped out of the canyon and into the rocks beside it. He moved like a ghost, silent, invisible, deadly. The first man never knew Jonas was there until the knife found his throat. Jonas lowered him silently and took his rifle and ammunition. The second man saw Jonas too late. A single shot from Jonas's revolver, muffled by the continuous gunfire, and he went down. Jonas moved to the next position. By the time Tate's men realized they were under attack from behind, Jonas had eliminated 3 of them and created complete chaos in their ranks. Men spun around, trying to find targets, shooting at shadows. The disciplined barrage fell apart as panic set in. Virgil Cobb's voice cut through the confusion, trying to restore order. "Fall back! Defensive positions. Watch your sectors." But it was too late. The psychological advantage had shifted. Jonas's counterattack had broken their momentum and their nerve. Men who'd been confident in their numbers suddenly realized they were vulnerable, that the ghost they'd been hunting was among them. Invisible and lethal, Jonas fired twice more, not trying for kills but adding to the chaos. Then he melted back into the rocks and circled around to return to the canyon. He found Maria at the rear position, her face pale but her rifle ready. "You came back," said I would. Jonas checked the canyon entrance. The firing had stopped completely. Through the smoke and dust, he could see Tate's men in full retreat, abandoning their positions, their will to fight completely broken. Garrison Tate himself was visible now, standing beside his horse, his face contorted with rage. He was screaming at Cobb, at his son Raymond, at anyone who would listen. But his men were done. They'd had enough of fighting a man who seemed unkillable, who turned every assault against them, who made them afraid of their own shadows. Cobb approached Tate, and even at this distance Jonas could see the confrontation. The foreman was saying something, his posture firm. Tate was shouting back, but Cobb wasn't backing down. Finally, Cobb turned to the remaining men and gave an order. They began packing up, preparing to leave. Tate grabbed Cobb's arm, still shouting, but Cobb shook him off and pointed south. The message was clear. The siege was over and they were leaving, but Garrison Tate wasn't done. He pulled his revolver and pointed it at Cobb. For a moment Jonas thought the cattle baron would actually shoot his own foreman. The men around them froze, hands moving toward their own weapons. Raymond Tate stepped forward, placing himself between his father and Cobb. He said something that Jonas couldn't hear, his hand on his father's arm. The elder Tate's face was purple with fury, but slowly, very slowly, he lowered the gun. Cobb said something else, a final statement, then walked to his horse and mounted. Most of the remaining men followed him. They rode south without looking back, leaving Garrison Tate standing with only his son and 2 loyal men who hadn't deserted. "They're leaving," Maria said, hardly believing it. "We won." "Not yet." Jonas kept his rifle trained on Tate. 4 men are still more than enough to be dangerous, especially when one of them has nothing left to lose. He was right. Garrison Tate stood there for a long moment, staring at the canyon entrance, where Jonas and Maria were concealed. Then he mounted his horse and began riding toward the canyon, not away from it, but straight at it. "He's coming," Maria said. "Why is he coming?" Jonas understood. Tate had lost everything. His men, his foreman, his intimidating force. But he still had pride and rage and the desperate need to salvage something from this disaster. He was going to try to finish this personally, even if it killed him. "Get down and stay hidden," Jonas ordered. "Don't show yourself no matter what happens. What are you going to do?" "What I have to." Jonas set down the rifle and drew his revolvers. He stepped out from cover, standing openly in the canyon entrance, Waiting, Garrison Tate rode forward with his son and the two remaining men flanking him. They stopped 50 yards from the entrance, well within pistol range. "It's over, Tate," Jonas called out. "Your men are gone. You've lost. Take your son and ride away while you still can." "You've destroyed everything," Tate said, his voice shaking with fury. "My reputation, my business, my plans. Years of work, ruined by one meddling old soldier and a rancher's daughter. You destroyed yourself. You killed good people for land and money. This is just the reckoning." "There won't be a reckoning." Tate's hand moved toward his gun. "There'll just be 4 graves in this canyon. No witnesses, no evidence. We'll tell people you and the girl died in the siege. The letter still exists. Maria copied it and hid pieces along our route. Kill us, and someone will still find it eventually." Tate's face twisted. "Then I'll die knowing I took you with me." His hand went for his gun. Raymond Tate grabbed his father's arm, trying to stop him, but the elder Tate shoved his son aside. The 2 loyal men hesitated, caught between following their employer and recognizing suicide when they saw it. Jonas drew and fired in one smooth motion. His first shot hit Garrison Tate's gun hand, sending his weapon flying. The second shot hit Tate's horse in the shoulder, sending the animal rearing and throwing its rider. The 2 loyal men reached for their guns, but Jonas was faster. 2 more shots and both men went down, wounded but alive. Jonas had aimed for legs, not vitals. They were just hired hands following orders. Not worth killing if it could be avoided. Raymond Tate dismounted and ran to his father, who was lying on the ground, clutching his bleeding hand. The young man looked up at Jonas with fear and something like understanding in his eyes. "He's done," Raymond called out. "We're done." No more fighting. Jonas kept his revolvers trained on them, but didn't fire. "Help your father onto his horse. Take these 2 with you. Ride south and don't look back. If I see any of you again, I won't be so merciful." Raymond helped his father up. Garrison Tate was pale with pain and shock, the fight finally driven out of him. He looked at Jonas with hatred, but also with the recognition of defeat. "This isn't over," Tate managed through gritted teeth. "Yes, it is," Jonas said. "Because even if you survive this, that letter is still going to Helena. Federal marshals will investigate. Everything you've done will come to light. Your empire is finished." Raymond got his father mounted, then helped the 2 wounded men onto their horses. The small group rode away slowly, beaten and broken, heading south toward whatever remained of Garrison Tate's once mighty cattle operation. Maria emerged from cover and stood beside Jonas, watching them go. "Is it really over?" Jonas holstered his revolvers. "The fighting is. But we still need to get to Helena, deliver that letter to the authorities, make sure justice is actually served." "How long will that take?" 2 weeks, maybe more. Long, hard travel through the high country." Jonas turned to look at her. "But we'll make it. The hard part's done." Maria looked at the bloodstains in the dirt where wounded men had fallen, at the scattered weapons and abandoned supplies. So much violence. So much death. Was it worth it? Jonas thought about Cal, dying to save his sister. About Maria's father, murdered for standing up to a tyrant. About all the nameless ranchers who'd been forced off their land or worse. Your family stood for what was right. They didn't give in to bullies. That's always worth fighting for. Jonas put a hand on Maria's shoulder. Your father and brother would be proud of you. You never broke, never gave up. That takes real courage. Maria touched the locket at her throat, the one with her family's photographs. Tears ran down her face, but she was smiling. Thank you, Jonas, for everything. They stood there in the canyon entrance as the sun climbed higher, 2 survivors of a battle that should have killed them both. The journey to Helena still lay ahead, but the worst was behind them now. Jonas allowed himself to think about Maria's offer, helping rebuild the ranch, being part of something constructive instead of just surviving. It sounded good. It sounded like a future worth having. Come on, he said gently. Let's gather what we need and start moving. The sooner we get this letter to the authorities, the sooner we can start rebuilding. They collected supplies from the abandoned camp, food, ammunition, 2 of the better horses that hadn't been rounded up. As they prepared to leave Devil's Gate, Jonas took one last look at the canyon that had been their fortress. He'd defended this ground successfully. turned back superior numbers, and survived against odds that should have killed him. It felt like a closing of a circle. The warrior he'd tried to bury in the mountains had returned one last time, not for glory or medals, but for something that actually mattered. Maybe that was the difference. Maybe that was what made it worth it this time. Jonas and Maria rode out of Devil's Gate as the afternoon sun painted the mountains in gold. Behind them lay death and destruction. Ahead lay justice, healing, and the possibility of peace. For the first time in years, Jonas felt something like hope. The journey to Helena took 16 days. Jonas and Maria traveled through the high country, staying off main trails, moving carefully but steadily. They encountered no further pursuit. Whatever remained of Garrison Tate's organization had apparently decided that revenge wasn't worth the cost. The days fell into a rhythm. They rose before dawn, traveled until midday, rested during the hottest hours, then moved again until dusk. Jonas taught Maria more about reading the land, finding water, identifying edible plants. She proved an eager student, absorbing knowledge that might save her life someday. At night they talked. Maria told stories about her father and Cal, about growing up on the ranch, about dreams deferred but not abandoned. Jonas found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about Sarah, about the war, about the long years of isolation in the mountains. Somehow, in Maria's presence, the memories lost some of their sharp edges. On the morning of the 16th day, they crested a ridge and saw Helena spread out below them. A real town with streets and buildings and the solid promise of civilization. After weeks in the wilderness, it looked almost unreal. There it is, Jonas said. The end of the road. They rode into Helena in the late afternoon, drawing curious looks from townspeople. Jonas and Maria were trail-worn and weathered, but they carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who'd survived something significant. The federal marshal's office was on Main Street, a solid brick building with the U.S. seal above the door. Jonas and Maria dismounted and stood for a moment, looking at the building that represented everything they'd fought for. "Ready?" Jonas asked. Maria pulled out the blood-stained letter and the land deed from where she'd kept them safe all these weeks. "Ready?" Marshal Thomas Hendricks was a man in his 50s, gray-haired and weathered, with the kind of steady gaze that came from years of enforcing the law in hard country. He listened without interrupting as Maria told her story, and Jonas provided corroboration. When she finished, Maria laid the letter and deed on his desk. Hendricks read the letter carefully, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked up at them both. "This is serious. If half of what's in this letter is true, Garrison Tate has committed enough crimes to hang 3 times over." He tapped the document. "But I'll need witnesses, corroboration, physical evidence. Can you provide that?" "The ranchers Tate forced out are still alive, scattered throughout the territory," Maria said. "They'll testify. And there are graves, my father's others, people who died standing up to Tate. I can testify to the attacks on the cabin," Jonas added. "To the siege, to Tate's hired guns. I can identify faces, provide details." Hendricks nodded slowly. "All right. I'll open an investigation. Federal jurisdiction means Tate can't buy his way out of this, can't use local influence. But I have to warn you, men like Tate have resources, lawyers, friends in high places. This could take months, maybe years to resolve." "I'm not going anywhere," Maria said firmly. "I'll wait as long as it takes." "What about Tate himself? Where is he now?" "Last we saw, he was wounded and headed back to his ranch," Jonas said. "That was over 2 weeks ago." "He could be anywhere by now. I'll send deputies to bring him in for questioning." Hendricks stood and offered his hand to Maria. "Miss Everett, you've shown remarkable courage. Your father would be proud." "Thank you, Marshal." Hendricks turned to Jonas. "And you, Jonas Hale, if I'm not mistaken." "Jonas the Ghost. I served under Colonel Morrison during the war. He spoke of you often, said you were the best soldier he ever commanded." Jonas shook the Marshal's hand. "That was a long time ago." "Maybe, but it seems the skills haven't faded." Hendricks smiled slightly. "The territory needs men like you, men who stand for what's right. If you're looking for work, I could use a deputy." The pay isn't great, but it's honest. Jonas glanced at Maria, who was watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and understanding. I appreciate the offer, Marshal, but I've got other plans. A ranch to help rebuild, a quieter life to figure out. Hendricks nodded. Can't say I blame you. Well, if you change your mind, the offer stands. They left the Marshal's office as the sun was setting, painting Helena's streets in warm, golden light. Maria turned to Jonas, and there were tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. We did it, she said. We actually did it. You did it, Jonas corrected. You survived, you kept fighting, you made sure your family's sacrifice meant something. That was all you. It was both of us. I couldn't have made it without you. They found rooms at a boarding house and spent the next few days resting, eating proper meals, and beginning the process of healing. Jonas visited a barber, got cleaned up and bought new clothes to replace his trail-worn gear. Maria did the same, and when Jonas saw her in a proper dress with her hair done up, he was struck again by how young she really was and how strong she'd become. On the third day, a telegram arrived from the territorial governor's office. Marshal Hendricks had wasted no time reporting the situation, and the governor wanted to meet with Maria personally to discuss Tate's crimes and the water rights situation. The meeting was formal and somewhat intimidating. The governor's office was impressive, and several territorial officials were present. But Maria handled herself with grace and dignity, answering questions clearly, providing details without embellishment. The officials seemed impressed by her composure and appalled by Tate's actions. We'll be conducting a full investigation, the governor promised. If the evidence supports your claims, and I believe it will, Garrison Tate will face justice. Moreover, we'll review all the land transfers in Ironwood Valley over the past 3 years. Any property acquired through fraud or coercion will be returned to its rightful owners, and my father's ranch, Maria asked, will be returned to you immediately, along with compensation for damages and lost revenue. The governor paused. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Everett. Your father was a good man. This territory needs more people like him. As they left the meeting, Maria was quiet, processing everything. Finally, she said, it's really happening. Justice is really going to be served, slowly, but yes. The wheels are turning. Jonas smiled at her. What will you do now? Go home. Rebuild the ranch, just like I said. Make it what Father wanted it to be. She looked up at him. My offer still stands, you know. I could use help. Someone who knows ranching, who's good with his hands, who... She paused, suddenly shy. Who I trust. Jonas had been thinking about this for days, weighing his options. He could return to the mountains, find another isolated cabin, go back to the solitary life he'd known. Or he could take a chance on something different, on community, on purpose, on healing. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that very much. Maria's face lit up with a smile that made her look even younger. Really, really. But I should warn you, I'm not easy to live around. I have nightmares sometimes. I get quiet and withdrawn. I'm still figuring out how to be around people again. That's all right. I'm still figuring out how to live without my family. We can figure things out together. She took his hand, a gesture that was both brave and tentative. Partners? Partners, Jonas agreed. 2 weeks later, they arrived at the Everett ranch. The main house was still standing, though it showed the effects of abandonment and the earlier violence. The barn had been burned but could be rebuilt. The fences needed mending, the fields had gone to seed, but the bones of a good ranch were still there. Jonas stood in the yard, looking at the work ahead, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Not for battle or survival, but for creation. For building something lasting. It's a lot of work, Maria said, standing beside him. Good, I like work. They spent the first week just cleaning and assessing damage. Neighbors who'd known Maria's father began stopping by, tentatively at first, then with increasing warmth. They brought food, offered help, shared stories about William Everett and how he'd stood up to Tate when others were too afraid. Jonas met these people and felt the weight of their gratitude. They knew what he and Maria had done, and they treated him like a hero. It made him uncomfortable at first, but Maria helped him understand that letting people thank him was a way of honoring their own courage too. all the small acts of resistance that had added up to Tate's downfall. A month after their return, Marshal Hendricks rode out to the ranch with news. Garrison Tate had been arrested and was awaiting trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just Maria's letter, but testimony from dozens of people he'd wronged. The railroad company had distanced themselves from him immediately, and his assets were being seized to provide restitution to his victims. "He's finished," Hendricks said. "Even if he somehow avoids hanging, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." His son Raymond is cooperating with authorities, providing evidence in exchange for leniency. And Virgil Cobb, Jonas asked, disappeared, rode out of the territory and hasn't been seen since. Smart man, he knew when to walk away. Hendricks looked around the ranch. "You're doing good work here. Place looks better already. It's coming together," Jonas said. After the marshal left, Jonas and Maria returned to work. They fell into an easy partnership. Maria handled the planning and the finances, while Jonas did the heavy physical work of rebuilding. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, talking about the day's progress and tomorrow's plans. Sometimes Jonas still had nightmares, dreams of the war, of burning cabins, of faces he couldn't save. But Maria was there when he woke, patient and understanding, reminding him that the past was the past, and the present was theirs to shape. 6 months after their return, the ranch was fully operational again. They had cattle in the fields, crops in the ground, and a new barn rising where the old one had burned. Neighbors helped with the barn raising, a day-long event filled with hard work, laughter, and community. Jonas found himself in the middle of it all, hammering nails and fitting beams, surrounded by people who'd become friends. He thought about the isolated cabin in the mountains, about 5 years spent avoiding exactly this kind of connection. He didn't miss it, not even a little. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the barn stood complete against the darkening sky, Maria found Jonas standing by the corral, looking at their work. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About your father, about Cal, about how they'd see this." Jonas gestured to the ranch. "We built something good here, something worth having. They would love it, both of them." Maria moved closer. "Jonas, can I ask you something? When you think about the future now, about next year, 5 years from now, what do you see?" Jonas thought about it carefully. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined any future at all. "But now, I see this ranch thriving. I see us making it work year after year. I see maybe teaching the next generation how to work the land, how to stand up for what's right." He looked at her. "I see a home, a real one, not just a place to hide." Maria smiled, and there was something in her expression that Jonas hadn't seen before. Possibility, hope, maybe even love. "That sounds like a good future." "It does," Jonas agreed. As fall turned to winter and winter gave way to spring, life on the ranch continued. Jonas learned to navigate the social world he'd avoided for so long. He attended church sometimes, helped neighbors with difficult work, became part of the community in ways he'd never thought possible. Marshal Hendricks visited occasionally with updates on the legal proceedings against Tate. The trial was moving forward, slowly but surely. More victims were coming forward, and the full scope of Tate's crimes was becoming clear. It would be years before everything was fully resolved, but justice was being served. One spring morning, Jonas woke early and walked out to the spot where Cal was buried. Maria had marked the grave with a simple headstone, and Jonas had planted wildflowers around it. He stood there for a while, thinking about the young man who'd given his life to save his sister. "We kept our promise," Jonas said quietly to the grave. "She's safe, she's thriving, and she's making something beautiful out of what you fought to protect." The wind rustled through the new grass, and Jonas took it as answer enough. He walked back to the house where Maria was starting breakfast. She smiled when she saw him, and Jonas felt that unfamiliar warmth again. Contentment, belonging, peace. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." They sat together at the table as the sun rose over the mountains. Outside, the ranch was waking up, cattle lowing, horses nickering, chickens clucking in their coop. It was the sound of life going on, of normalcy, of home. Jonas thought about the medal tucked away in his saddlebag, the one he'd carried from his old cabin. He'd thought about throwing it away, about leaving that part of his life behind completely. But Maria had convinced him to keep it, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a reminder that the capacity for courage could be used for good. "What are you thinking about?" Maria asked, recognizing his reflective mood. "About how sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters," Jonas said. "About how the things we run from have a way of following us until we turn and face them. And I'm glad I stopped running. Glad that wounded man showed up at my door. Glad I had the chance to fight for something that mattered." He looked at Maria. "Glad I had the chance to help you, to be part of something good." Maria reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm glad too, more than I can say." They finished breakfast and began the day's work. There was fencing to mend, animals to tend, 100 tasks that came with running a ranch. But Jonas approached them all with a kind of quiet satisfaction he'd never experienced before. The war had made him a killer. Isolation had made him a hermit. But Maria and her family's fight for justice had given him something he'd thought was lost forever, a purpose, a home, and the possibility of redemption. As the sun climbed higher and the work continued, Jonas allowed himself to think about the future, not with dread or emptiness, but with genuine hope. The mountains still stood on the horizon, beautiful and eternal, but Jonas no longer needed to hide in them. He'd found his place here, in the valley, building something lasting with someone who understood both his strengths and his scars. It wasn't the life he'd expected, but it was the life he needed. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jonas Hale was truly home. The story of the mountain man who didn't hide but loaded his rifle would be told for years across the Montana Territory, a tale of courage, justice, and one man's stand against impossible odds. But for Jonas, the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about learning that running from your past only delays the reckoning, that the skills forged in darkness can serve the light, and that sometimes the greatest battles we fight are not for glory or survival, but for the chance to build something worth protecting. In the end, that was enough.